Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Russia and the United States appear to be determined, at least in public, that the scheduled Syria talks should happen without delay. Is this realistic? Russia's legal intervention on the side of Damascus has stabilized the Syrian state. The other side, or sides, are anything but. To Crosstalk Syria, I'm joined by my guest, Fawaz Georges in London. He is the chair of Contemporary Middle Eastern Studies at LSE, as well as author of the upcoming book, ISIS, A History. In New York, we have Daniel Wagner. He is the CEO of Country Risk Solutions. And in Texas, we cross to Daniel McAdams. He's the executive director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. All right, Crosstalk rules. In effect, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Daniel, if I go to you in Clute here, we have a whole flurry over the last few days and weekend, a flurry of diplomatic activity here. And obviously, when it comes to the United States and Russia, they're talking about one or two topics, Syria and Ukraine. We're going to focus on Syria on this program here. Is it realistic, the January 25th deadline to start these talks? Is it realistic that anything's going to happen?
Well, I think they're already talking about, I think Kerry said we may need a delay of 1 or 2 days or something like this. So I think, you know, the issues remain completely unresolved. Who will represent the opposition on the other side of the table? And we saw this high negotiating committee picked Mohammed Aloush as their spokesperson just recently. This is the political leader of the Army of Islam, which is an al-Qaeda affiliated group which has killed Christians, Shia, it loves to kill Druze and Alawites. So this is the person that the U.S. and the Saudis have picked to represent the other side. The question is, will Russia and Damascus allow this person to sit down at the table as a normal citizen and discuss the issues?
Fawaz, Daniel brings up a very good point here, because on the Syrian side, they have presumably their delegation and its uniform. They know what they want and they have their agenda. It's the other side that is confused, has conflicting agendas, and we have countries like Turkey that says they won't even show up if the Kurds are involved. And like it or not, the Kurds are playing a pretty big role in all of this. Fawaz, go ahead in London. What do you think is going to happen with these talks?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't think we should expect any major results, even if the talks happen at the end of this month. No one expects any major breakthrough. What the Russians and the Americans are trying to do is to begin the process of talks. This is bound to be prolonged, complex, difficult, because, as you said, there is no common ground. The balance of power inside Syria does not really favor any major party. The opposition is deeply divided. You have a fierce regional war by proxy inside Syria. But one particular point we need to stress, you have to start somewhere. And the Russians and the Americans would like basically to have both sides sitting on the same table, establish a mechanism for talks, begin the process of building trust. So it's the beginning of a highly difficult process.
Daniel, in New York, if I can go to you, I bet you a lot of people that could be sitting around that table wish it were back to 2012, because the parameters to sit down to negotiate an end of that conflict were there. It was within reach, and the Americans said no. And that's when we heard Assad must go. Amazing what's happened since then. Go ahead.
Well, I think Mr. Assad would be among the people who wish they could turn the clock back 4 years. But on the basic subject of these discussions and their chances of success, I think we have to recall the old adage, you have to crawl before you walk and walk before you run. We're in the crawling stage here. Exactly. We have to be very clear to set our expectations rather low, because the sands are shifting to such a degree that even if the people get around the table, and even if there is some momentum in the interim, with all of the dynamics that are going on, who knows how long any progress may last.
Yeah.
I wish I could be more optimistic, but at this stage of the game, I'd have to say the chances of any kind of meaningful outcome would be 10% or less.
If I can go back to Daniel and Clute, I tend to agree there, and I think that as things stand right now, I'll be provocative and go against the conventional wisdom, is that I don't think there is a political solution to this. it's way, way beyond that, considering the type of people that are on the ground that are being supported by outside powers like Saudi Arabia, by Turkey turning a blind eye to ISIS and its financial dealings with oil and whatnot here. And I think that's why the Russians have said to the regime in Damascus, you're going to have to win this war and we're going to help you. That's provocative. Go ahead, Daniel, and Clute.
Frankly, Peter, I completely agree with you. I mean, there's no point if you're leading. There's no point to sit down in negotiations. I mean, it's a brutal thing to say.
Yep.
But the facts on the ground, there's a danger of Russia winning all the battles, but actually losing the war. And I think what's going to happen, here's my prediction, I guess it's coming too early in the show, but we remember from Kosovo, we remember how these things operate. You're going to see a push for essentially a one-sided ceasefire, where anytime Damascus moves, anytime Assad moves a finger, he's going to be accused of violating it.
Yep.
Meantime, you're going to see all these various groups continue fighting, just like Kosovo in 1999, or what was it, 1199, the UN resolution. They'll get some UN resolution calling for this ceasefire. The U.S. will then use this as a piece of paper they hold up, as they put in monitors like the KVM monitors, and they will move in. And anytime something happens, it's always going to be Damascus's fault. Next thing you know, bombs away. I mean, this is the scenario that is happening, that's going to unfold now that the U.S. sees the huge disadvantage to the people that they have supported over these past 4 years, at least 4 or 5 years, 6 years.
Would you like to react to that, what we just heard from Daniel and Clute? Go ahead.
Yes. First of all, the Americans are not going to intervene militarily. Syria is not a strategic priority for the Americans. There has been a major shift in the American position.
They already occupy. I'm sorry, but they already occupy an air base right now. They just moved in this week and took over an air base in Syria.
The Americans no longer insist on Assad removal. They have accepted the Russian position that there must be a gradual process of transition inside Syria. The Russian military intervention has changed the rules of the game. The Americans now concede, including the head of the U.S. Army, that the Syrian army has shifted from defense into offense. The opposition is in a difficult position. The Obama administration is trying to help local forces, but he has made it very clear he will not intervene either in Syria or Iraq. This is part of the Obama-Barack strategy. The reality on the ground now is that everyone, the Russians, the Americans, everyone, the Iranians, says that there is no military solution. This is now part of a civil war, and that's why you need to start somewhere, even though you need a political miracle. Even though you need a political miracle to start a political process, you have to start somewhere, because you cannot win militarily.
Okay, well, I agree with you, but I think it's illusory at this point because of the correlation of forces on the ground. Daniel, if I can go to you and kind of echoing what Daniel and Clute had to say, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to be pessimistic here and skeptical, but, you know, in Ukraine in February 2014, there was a deal for political transition there, and at the very last second, and Barack Obama has said it publicly, that they had made their own arrangements for a political transition right there, and that's called a coup. Okay, my point in saying this here, because I'm trying to bring up empirical evidence, facts, not just opinions here, is that who can you trust in these negotiations? Just like Daniel said, you pass a resolution there, and then you point your finger and say, look, Assad did that, go after Assad. Nobody else is ever held guilty, is seen as guilty in this civil war. From a Western perspective, it's always Damascus, and it's always Assad. Go ahead, Daniel, in New York.
Well, my own view here, and to echo your earlier sentiments, Peter, regarding the pessimism about even a political solution, if there's no military solution and there's no political solution, is there a solution at all? Or are people going to imagine that they've achieved some sort of solution, and then we end up with a 30 years war or a perpetual war, or we can call it another Iraq? I mean, my own view here, again, is that it's likelier that there will be no solution of any kind for many, many years to come. And yet, of course, they have to at least try. So we should be applauding that effort, but I think anyone who's imagining that it's going to result in something meaningful or successful with an outcome that's even marginally acceptable for the most significant players is dreaming.
You know, okay, Daniel in New York, you know, I can see where you're coming from. If I go to Daniel and Clute here, but you know, the fact of the matter is that even if the United States has goodwill, and that's it's a big if in my opinion here, but you know, does Saudi Arabia ever have any goodwill right now? Or is it its entire point now is it sees the correlation of forces changing in the region against itself here, and it still has Assad in Damascus here. What's to stop them from breaking away? I don't see the Saudis playing any constructive role whatsoever. They haven't from the very, very beginning, and I don't see that they will be a player of goodwill moving forward. Go ahead, Daniel and Clute.
Sure, if I can back up just a half a second, though. The previous speaker talked about the U.S. backing down and pulling out. I'm sorry, that's just not the case. It was just yesterday, it was just a couple of days ago, actually, that Ashton Carter said that the U.S. is going to accelerate its actions in Iraq. We saw the U.S. took over a Syrian air base in Kurdish territory, but still Syrian sovereign territory. You know, the idea that the U.S. is backing off is completely wrong. Also, the idea that the U.S. has accepted the idea that Assad can stay is totally wrong. If you look at what the U.S. actually says, what Kerry actually says, he's saying the same thing differently. He's saying Assad must go in a little bit more of a candy-coated way. Well, we're going to manage a political transition. He can stay for a couple of weeks. Then we'll have elections. And of course, nothing about whether he'll be on the ballot, which he would probably be elected if he was. So I think this whole thing is gone. The idea of whether the U.S. is an honest broker in this whole thing and whether the Saudis actually are going to accept the facts on the ground. Well, John Kirby, the U.S. State Department spokesman, said he absolutely agrees with the Saudis that the only negotiating partner can be this high council led by an al-Qaeda affiliate. So I think that there is certainly seeing a meeting of the minds there. As for the Saudis, I think the Saudis are freaking out because they've gotten themselves in such a deep hole. They've had to introduce currency controls on their currency because it's going into the tank. They gambled on oil prices and they're eating oil now. They had a stupid war in Yemen that's been absolutely disastrous.
Okay, Daniel, I'm going to jump in here, gentlemen. We're going to have to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Syria. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing developments in the Syrian conflict. Okay, I'd like to go back to Fawaz in London. In my introduction to the program, I talked about the other side or sides when it comes to this conflict here. So we have Damascus and its coalition and then everybody else. You know, one of the things I found interesting over the last few days is that the Israeli defense minister said that they prefer ISIL or ISIS to Tehran. And it really, I find it really kind of interesting is that here again, the other sides, all of them have all of these different agendas here. We have Turkey with its very specific agenda that actually has moved troops into northern Syria with, remarkably, no resistance. You know, apparently they have a relationship with ISIL there. And then we have what we've mentioned, Saudi Arabia, and plus with the sanctions coming down with Iran, Iran is feeling more emboldened in the region here, and it certainly should have a prominent place at the negotiating table if the other sides can agree to it. This is the complications. That, you know, the outcome should be very clear, the end hostilities here, but because of the other sides and they're all conflicting agendas, that's probably makes the chances less than 10%. Someone's mentioned the number here. I would even say less than 10%. Go ahead, Fawaz in London.
Well, Peter, I mean, you've asked several questions in one. Let me just break down the questions because you're raising a really important point. The first point, the reason why ISIS or ISIL or the so-called Islamic State has done as well as it has been able to manipulate and exploit the geostrategic rivalries in the region. As you said, Turkey's agenda is not to really wage all-out war against ISIS, but to prevent the Kurds from having an autonomous state and to topple the Assad regime. Israel, I mean, Israel, this is an ideal situation for Israel. The Syrian army has been neutralized. The Iraqi army neutralized. There are no Arab armies. So in the sense, Iran and Hezbollah are the two most strategic threats to Israel. So that's why they prefer ISIL or ISIS to Iran or Hezbollah. The big point is I am not disagreeing about the chances of the minimalist chances for a settlement in Syria. If my reading is correct, what's happening in Syria now, mainly regional wars by proxies. What you need is basically an agreement between the great powers, the United States and Russia. This is the most important step. Once the Americans and the Russians come to an agreement, and then basically they come down heavily on the regional allies, you also need to end the regional war by proxies. This is the beginning. Without a global power agreement,
in theory,
please.
I absolutely agree with you. Everything you said, I completely agree with you. But in reality, if I can go to Daniel in New York, I don't see the Americans being able to control its surrogates on the ground. Not at all right now, particularly since Riyadh is so miffed right now with the nuclear deal. They're going to go their own way, just to spite themselves even. So I worry very much about that. These groups that have been emboldened, been armed, been given money, support over the last few years, some really egregious groups of people here. There are, and we've seen it all the way from Afghanistan in the 1980s all the way to the present. Once you let these people out, you can't control them. And this is the fault of Saudi Arabia, the Gulf countries, Turkey, and the United States, okay? I don't see them be able to control that. I agree in theory it should be. The great powers come into agreement. Russia and Assad can work together. They've proven it over and over again. Can the U.S. control its allies? I doubt it. Daniel.
Well, the genie's clearly out of the bottle. There is no putting it back in. However, I would like to add what Fawaz was saying, which is not only, of course, does the U.S. and Russia need to be at the table, but there's no way there's going to be any progress, meaningful progress made if the Iranians and the Saudis are not sitting at the same table. And given what's happening with them, with the knives really out and the bare knuckles, the gloves are off, I really don't see how they're going to sit down at the table and have any kind of a realistic discussion here. So if you put all that together, and it's not just the U.S. and it's not just Russia and it's not even just Syria, you have to have Saudi Arabia and Iran involved, and I don't see them sitting down.
I agree. Daniel, and if I go back to you in Texas, again, going back to my thesis about a military victory here, I think that the Russians are saying, look, we're going to give all this diplomacy a chance because the Russians have been able to show that they are diplomatically minded. When Russia decided to intervene at the request of the Damascus government, it talked to every single regional player, a legitimate regional player, and then they made their announcement at the General Assembly of the United Nations here. I can see, Russia being able to push diplomacy, but if there's just no will on the other sides here, that's why I think they're saying to Assad, they've made it clear, actually, over the last few weeks, we're here for the long term, as long as this conflict goes on. And I think that their aim is to finally win this war here, until there is really genuine goodwill on the other side, as I keep stressing. Go ahead.
Well, I think you're right, and I think the other guests are right, too, that if the great powers, if Russia and the U.S. were to agree on what the end goal was, certainly that would facilitate a political solution, and that is really what we all should hope for. But again, there are specific questions that are not answered, and until they're answered, the idea of even having a conference is moot. One of them, as I think it was Daniel in New York said, very good point, that Iran and Saudi Arabia have to sit at the table. I think that's probably more likely to happen than the agreement of who will represent the opposition in Syria. Lavrov said, the foreign minister of Russia said, will not accept any terrorist groups. Very clearly, the Army of Islam, if not a terrorist group itself, certainly has fought alongside. At what point do you become contaminated when you fight alongside al-Qaeda? Will they accept this? That's one. And two, will they accept democracy in Syria, where a truly free and fair vote, where everyone is allowed to be represented, not like in Victoria Nuland's Ukraine, where the opposition parties, who were once the ruling parties, are all outlawed, and the poor old Communist Party is all in jail. Not that kind of election, but a real election. On those two specific things, will the U.S. compromise at all? And right now, I'd have to say the answer is no, because behind John Kerry, who I think to some degree has done a great job with Iran and probably has some good intentions in Syria, but behind him are people like Victoria Nuland, are the neocons in Washington, who no matter who is the president, they're always in the corridors of power, whether in the think tanks or in the State Department or wherever else they are. They're the ones that are pushing the buttons and turning the knobs. And until we deal with this problem in U.S. foreign policy, I'm afraid we can't be too optimistic.
Fawaz, if I go back to you in London.
Hey, Peter, could I
go ahead, jump
here?
in. Daniel in New York, jump in. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to make a point, and I'm wondering if it might actually be too early to even explore this peace process. I'm wondering if it might not make sense 6, 12, 18 months from now, after the landscape has shifted a little bit, after the Russian campaign has had a chance to be a bit more successful, after a new president is in the seat in the U.S., and after things have developed a little bit more with this transitional process. I sort of think that it's too early to even engage in the peace process. I wonder what others think about that.
Well, that's one of the reasons, that's probably the reason we're making this program here, because looking at the statements coming from the Lavrov-Kerry meeting, I was scratching my head too, and Daniel included, pointed out that maybe even because of what's happening with the Kurds, it would slip a little bit. But I'm completely agreeing with Daniel in New York, is that I don't see any reason whatsoever right now. It's a lot of false hope right now. But Fawaz is absolutely correct. You have to start somewhere. I don't know where that somewhere is. Go ahead, Fawaz in London.
First of all, Peter, the Security Council passed a resolution.
Right.
And it was the Security Council that basically stipulated that the first round of talks start on the 21st of January. So the Russians and the Americans are trying very hard to start the process. Point one. Point two, there is no military solution, people. The Russians have said it, the Americans have said it, the Saudis have said it, the Iranians have said you cannot win in Syria militarily. The country has gone into thousands of pieces. Secondly, you have to end the state of humanitarian catastrophe. You have 60% of the Syrian people are either refugees or even displaced people. You have 6 million people who are refugees. In terms of the refugee crisis, you need to start somewhere, and the international community has a moral and legal responsibility to start. Finally, the point about the American position, and I defer to my colleagues in the United States to talk about the American position, even though I've written extensively about the American position. The American priority, Daniel, is not Assad. The American priority is ISIS, ISIS, ISIS.
Oh, there's no evidence to support that. Over the last few years, there's very little evidence to support that.
You mean supporting them or taking them down?
It looks like they're supporting them, not destroying them. Why did so many American sorties destroy Syrian infrastructure first, not against terrorists? It shows that they're destroying the state, not terrorism.
ISIS attacks in basically in Paris, in Beirut, in the United States, the pressure is overwhelming on the Obama administration. And the American strategy now devotes more attention, more resources, and that's why the talk about speeding up the strategy. The meeting in Paris, the Russians and the Americans, the militaries are talking to each other. I mean, the head of the American military said he talks to his Russian counterpart. There is a major shift. There is a major shift in the American strategy.
Well, it's really quite remarkable, Fawaz. If I go to Daniel include here, is that we heard Seymour Hersh in his latest research, his writings about what was going on in Syria, is that the American military had to go behind the back of the President of the United States to actually get something constructive done in dealing with Syria. We're almost out of time. Daniel include, go ahead.
Well, I think it's instructive, actually, to look at Hillary's emails that have been released while she was Secretary of State. They've come out. She was fully briefed on the fact that Islamists would take over, essentially ISIS and al-Qaeda would take over in Libya after the U.S. did a regime change. She knew it. She still pushed it and went along with it. I'm afraid that instinct, that spirit, that inability to accept the fact that your foreign policy of interventionism is mistaken, that has not changed in Washington. And until it does, I'm afraid the U.S. will not change its view, and it will not be able to defeat ISIS or whatever in Syria.
All right, gentlemen, on that point, we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in London, New York, and Clute. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules. I love it.